There is a fight happening at every boat ramp in America, and it has been going on for as long as there have been two kinds of water to fish. On one side, the saltwater angler, who points offshore and says, "My fish is the size of a refrigerator. My fights last half a day. I have been dragged around an ocean by an animal that could kill me." On the other side, the freshwater angler, who points at a suburban pond and says, "My fish has seen more lures than you have caught fish in your life, and I still have to fool it with an inch of line it can basically read." Both of them are arguing about the wrong thing. They think the question is which fish is harder to beat. It isn't. The real question, the one nobody at the ramp is actually asking, is this: which angler's brain is solving the harder problem? Because the fish in saltwater and the fish in freshwater are not just different sizes. They are living inside two completely different sets of physical laws. And once you see what those laws are, you'll understand why the skills almost never transfer, why a saltwater legend can get humiliated on a farm pond, and why which is harder has a real answer that has nothing to do with how big the fish gets. Welcome back to Fishing Lab Explained. I'm going to take a side today, but I'm going to make you earn it with me, one law at a time. Let's start where the tackle shop argument always starts, with size, because I want to concede it completely, and then show you why it's a trap. Saltwater grows bigger fish. This is not close. The heaviest fish ever landed on rod and reel under IGFA all-tackle rules is a great white shark of over 2,600 pounds, taken off South Australia back in 1959. The largest recognized blue marlin comes in over 1,300 pounds. Bluefin tuna have been recorded near 1,500. Freshwater has its own giants. A Mekong giant catfish in Thailand, near 650 pounds. Wells catfish in Europe that push past 200. White sturgeon and alligator gar, well over 100 in the right water. Real monsters. And every one of them is still a fraction of what the open ocean grows without trying. So the ocean wins on raw mass. But here's the thing. The size argument never explains why. Why does saltwater grow bigger animals? And the answer is the first hint that we're really talking about two different physical worlds. The ocean is the largest connected habitat on the planet. No shoreline to hem a fish in, prey production on a scale no lake can match, and a fish like a tuna or a marlin that never stops swimming through an effectively unlimited volume. A largemouth bass lives its entire life in a space a tuna would cross in an afternoon. Bigger environment, bigger energy budget, bigger animal. The size gap isn't about the fish being tougher. It's about the size of the box the fish lives in. And that reframes the whole size argument. Because bigger does not mean harder to catch. It means harder to land. A different verb entirely, and we'll get to it. Catching, the part that happens before the fight, actually runs the other direction. Let me prove it with the single most stubborn number in the sport. The most famous freshwater record in the world has stood since 1932. George Perry's largemouth bass, 22 pounds, 4 ounces, out of a Georgia lake. It held the outright record for over 75 years before it was finally tied, not beaten, by an angler in Japan in 2009. Sit with that, nearly a century of the most obsessive, best-funded, most technologically armed pursuit of a single fish in the history of angling. Sonar, purpose-built trophy lakes, genetic base programs, billions of casts, and nobody has landed a bigger one. Now compare that to saltwater, where all tackle records fall regularly as boats push into water no one has fished before. That contrast tells you something profound, and it's the door into my actual argument. Freshwater records don't stand for 90 years because the fish are rare. They stand because the fish are hard. And to understand why they're hard, you have to understand the law that governs a freshwater angler's entire life. Here is that first law. It's called fishing pressure, and it is the closest thing freshwater fishing has to gravity. Think about the geometry. The average American lives minutes from fishable fresh water, a pond, a creek, a reservoir. It's cheap, it's close, you don't need a boat or a captain, which is wonderful, and it's also the problem. That same accessibility means a single popular base lake can be worked by thousands of anglers in one season, all throwing at the same fish. In a body of water a marlin wouldn't consider a puddle. Now flip to the open ocean. A pelagic tuna ranges across thousands of square miles and may go its entire life without ever seeing a lure. So the freshwater fish and the saltwater fish are not experiencing the same sport at all. The freshwater fish lives under relentless, repeated, individualized human contact. The saltwater fish, for the most part, does not. And that single difference in exposure rewires the freshwater fish's brain, literally. This is where the folklore ends and the biology starts. Anglers love to say pressured fish get smart and then wave their hands. Let me give you the actual mechanism, because it's better than the folklore. It's a form of learning every animal with a nervous system has, and it has a name. The core process is associative avoidance learning. The fish pairs a stimulus, a certain lure, a certain flash, a certain vibration, with a genuinely traumatic event, getting hooked and hauled through the air, and it updates its behavior to avoid that stimulus. This is the same learning that makes a mouse avoid a trap, and we have hard, replicated evidence it operates in the exact fish you chase. The most important work here comes out of the long-term largemouth bass studies at what is now the Illinois Natural History Survey, most associated with the fisheries biologist David Philip. Across decades of research, Philip and his colleagues demonstrated something remarkable. Vulnerability to angling is partly heritable. They selectively bred bass into high vulnerability and low vulnerability lines, fish genetically easier or harder to catch, and the trait passed to their offspring. Read what that means. On heavily fished water, angling is not just teaching individual fish, it is acting as a selection pressure on the whole population, catching and removing the genetically catchable fish, and leaving the wary ones to breed. We are, cast by cast, artificially selecting for a smarter bass. The freshwater angler isn't fishing a lake, they're fishing an arms race that they themselves are driving. So now watch what that law does to the freshwater angler's actual technique, because everything the finesse angler does is a response to it. Light line, because a pressured fish inspects. Natural presentations, because the obvious ones have been punishing fish for years. Long casts and stealth, because these fish associate the boat, the shadow, the splash, with danger. The freshwater angler is fishing against an animal that has been actively taught, and in some populations genetically shaped, to distrust exactly what they're offering. The precision isn't showing off. It's the only thing that works against a target that has effectively been vaccinated against your lures. Now, the saltwater angler. Different law entirely, and here's where I hand the argument back to their side, because their hard problem is just as real. It's just physical instead of psychological. Set aside the average snapper trip, which is short and sharp, and honestly not that different from a good bass fight. I'm talking about the offshore big game world, because that's the ceiling, and the ceiling is genuinely brutal. The endurance records here are almost hard to believe. In 1968, off Cabo Blanco, Peru, there's a documented case of an angler battling a large black marlin, and offshore history is full of these multi-hour wars. Fish fought well past the point of exhaustion, anglers strapped into fighting chairs until the crew ends it for the angler's own safety. These are not fish stories. They're the physical reality of hooking an animal that outweighs you by hundreds of pounds in a medium where it has every advantage. And I want to explain the physics of why that fight is so devastating, because this is the mechanism the size argument skips. When you fight a big fish, you are not fighting its weight. You're fighting its weight plus the drag of water against its body, plus the leverage it generates with a tail built for open ocean speed. Water is about 800 times denser than air. Every time that fish turns broadside and beats its tail, it's pushing against a wall of fluid, and you are on the other end of the line, absorbing that load through your back, your arms, your legs. A marlin or a big tuna is one of the most powerful athletes on Earth, and it's using the density of the ocean as a weapon. That's why offshore anglers genuinely go to the hospital, soft tissue injuries, back injuries, from fights that last hours. The freshwater angler almost never faces this, because even a big pike or a Wells catfish, strong as they are, simply cannot load a human body the way a green marlin in open water can, for as long. The upper ceiling of pure physical difficulty belongs to saltwater, decisively, and I won't pretend otherwise. But now here's the reframe I've been building toward, the thing that reorganizes this entire debate. Watch what happens when we stop comparing fish and start comparing the two invisible forces the anglers are actually fighting. The saltwater angler's hard problem is the ocean itself, not the fish, the water. The single biggest variable offshore is a force the freshwater angler barely thinks about: the tide and the current it drives. In saltwater, the structure literally moves. A spot that's dead at slack water turns on hard when the tide starts pushing bait past a point and shuts off again an hour later. The productive window can be minutes long, keyed to a moving mass of water on a 6-hour cycle, layered on top of wind, swell, and weather that can turn a flat, calm morning into a dangerous ride by afternoon. Reading that, knowing where the fish will be feeding 2 hours from now as the current builds against a piece of bottom you can't even see, is a genuine expertise that takes years. The saltwater angler is solving a fluid dynamics problem in real time. The freshwater angler's hard problem is the opposite. Their structure doesn't move. The rock is where it was last year, and that stability sounds easier, until you realize what it does. Because the water is stable and the pressure is relentless, the freshwater game collapses down onto a razor-thin margin of precision. When the environment stops being the variable, the fish's learned wariness becomes the entire game. The saltwater angler asks, where and when will the current position the fish? The freshwater angler already knows where the fish is, and asks, how do I fool an animal that is sitting right there, that I can practically see, and that has rejected this exact presentation from 100 anglers before me? One problem is dynamic and physical, the other is static and psychological. Neither is easy, but they are not the same problem, and that's the whole reason the skills don't transfer. And it goes even deeper than behavior, down to a difference in the fish's own body that almost no angler ever thinks about. This is the part I most want you to leave with, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. A freshwater fish and a saltwater fish are, at the cellular level, solving inverted survival problems every second they're alive. It's called osmoregulation, and it's beautiful. A freshwater fish's body is saltier than the water around it. So by simple osmosis, water is constantly flooding into its body, trying to dilute it, and its precious salts are constantly leaking out. To survive, a freshwater fish is essentially bailing a boat. Its kidneys pump out enormous volumes of dilute urine to shed the flood, and specialized cells in its gills work constantly to claw salt back in from the environment. A saltwater fish has the exact reverse problem, less salty than the ocean, so water is constantly being sucked out of its body. It's slowly dehydrating in an ocean of water. To survive, it literally drinks seawater all day, and its gills pump the excess salt back out. Two fish 20 feet apart at a river mouth, running their entire metabolisms in opposite directions just to hold steady. This is documented, foundational fish physiology. The work of physiologists like David Evans laid much of the modern groundwork. Now, why should you, an angler, care about fish kidneys? Because it's the deepest reason the two disciplines never merged into one sport. That physiological wall is exactly why the vast majority of fish species are locked to one side of it, why you can't just move a bass into the ocean or a tuna into a lake. The animals evolved into two separate worlds and specialize so hard for each that they can't cross. The angler is a mirror of the fish. The freshwater specialist and the saltwater specialist adapted to two different physical universes so completely that they too struggle to cross. The reason a brilliant offshore captain flounders on a bass pond isn't lack of skill. It's that every instinct they built, read the current, cover water, outmuscle the fish, is tuned to a world where the water moves and the fish is naive. Drop them into a world where the water is still and the fish is educated, and their instincts point the wrong way, and vice versa. The fish can't cross the salinity line. The angler can't cross the skill line. Same wall, two sides. And there's one more layer to that two worlds idea, and it's the one that pays off directly in your tackle box, so stay with me. The two fish don't just balance their salt differently. In a lot of cases, they don't even see the same colors, and the reason is the water itself. Here's the biology, and it's genuinely one of the most elegant things in fish vision. In 2015, a team led by Joseph Corbo at Washington University School of Medicine published work in the journal Current Biology identifying a single enzyme, CYP27C1, that acts like a switch on a fish's eye. When it's active, it converts one form of vitamin A into another, and that chemical swap physically shifts the fish's vision toward the red, long wavelength end of the spectrum, tuning the eye to see deeper into red and even near-infrared light. Now think about why that matters. Clear ocean water and clear lakes let blue light penetrate deepest, so a lot of open water and clear water fish are built to see in the blue-green range. But murky, stained, tannic freshwater, the tea-colored ponds and rivers so many of you actually fish, filters out blue and leaves red and yellow light dominating. And fish living in that water lean on exactly this red-shifting machinery to see in it. The environment is literally tuning the eye to match its own available light. This is the deep version of a rule you already half know. Bright chartreuse and red crankbaits earn their reputation in stained water not because they're louder, but because they sit in the exact slice of the spectrum a stained water fish is physically built to detect, while a natural blue-silver bait that kills it in clear water can go nearly invisible in the tannic stuff. You're not picking colors by superstition, you're matching a lure to the specific photoreceptor chemistry the water has installed in that fish's eye. Different water, different light, different eye. The two worlds principle again, right down to the color you tie on. Let me tie the danger in here too, because it follows the exact same split, and it's genuinely useful to understand. The two disciplines don't just fish differently, they get hurt differently, and the freshwater risk is the one that's wildly underrated. Saltwater danger is the one everyone pictures, distance and scale. Offshore, you can be many miles from land, dependent on an engine, exposed to weather that turns fast. When something goes wrong out there, help is measured in a very different way than on a lake 300 yards from the ramp. That's real, but the freshwater killer is quieter and closer, and the physics behind it is stark. It's cold water. Water pulls heat from your body dramatically faster than air of the same temperature. And the danger isn't mainly the slow hypothermia people imagine. It's the first 60 seconds. It's called the cold shock response, and it's been carefully documented by immersion physiologists, most notably Professor Michael Tipton's group at the University of Portsmouth. The instant you go into cold water, you get an involuntary, uncontrollable gasp, followed by hyperventilation you cannot suppress by willpower. If your head is underwater during that gasp, you inhale water, and this can kill a strong swimmer in the water temperatures a northern lake or river holds for much of the year. That's the cruel asymmetry. The freshwater angler feels safe. Shore is right there. The water looks calm, which is exactly why they so often aren't wearing a life jacket when they go over the side of a small boat in spring. The danger doesn't announce itself with waves and distance. It's a physiological reflex that hits in 1 second in water that looks harmless. Please respect it. So, after all of that, which is actually harder? Here's my honest verdict, and I've earned the right to give it now. It is a category error to ask which is harder, and the fact that the tackle shop argument never ends is the proof. They are measuring two different axes. Saltwater fishing, at its offshore peak, is harder on the body and harder against the environment. You are managing a fluid, dangerous, moving world and an animal that can physically break you. Freshwater fishing, on pressured public water, is harder on the mind and harder against the fish. You are trying to deceive an educated, sometimes genetically selected animal in a static world where deception is the only lever you have left. The ocean tests whether you can withstand the water. The lake tests whether you can outthink the fish. But if you put a gun to my head, and this is a freshwater channel, so you know I'm biased and I'll own that, I'll say this: the freshwater problem is the harder one to fully solve. And here's the non-tribal reason. The saltwater variables, brutal as they are external and readable. The tide will do what the tide does. The weather is on the radar. You can study them. But the freshwater fish's wariness is an intelligent, adapting opponent that changes specifically in response to you. Every angler who fishes that lake makes the fish a little harder for the next angler. It's the only version of the sport where your quarry is actively getting better at beating you. You're not solving a puzzle. You're playing chess against an opponent that studies your last move. The ocean is indifferent. The pressured base is learning. And I think fooling something that's learning is the deeper skill. That's my case. Now I actually want yours, because this is the argument that never dies, and I want to see it fought properly in the comments. If you've fished both, really fished both, I want to know which one humbled you more, and why. And here's the specific question I want you to answer, because it cuts right to everything we just covered. Did the ocean beat you with its power, or did a lake beat you with a single fish that just would not be fooled? One of those is a test of your body. The other is a test of your mind. Tell me which one broke you. One last thing, and it matters. If you fish either of these worlds, know the specific fish and size limits where you are. Slot limits, seasons, and protected species vary enormously state to state and coast to coast, and the biggest fish are often the ones the law protects. Check your state and local regulations before you keep anything. The whole point of understanding fish this well is to still have them to argue about in 30 years. This is Fishing Lab Explained. If this gave you a new way to see water you thought you understood, subscribe, and go settle the debate down in the comments. I'll be reading them. I'll see you on the water, whichever kind you fish.